On a seemingly ordinary afternoon, the sun hung low over the city, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of a quiet street. David Louise, a man of steady gait and sharper mind, walked with purpose, his thoughts drifting to the cases he'd been piecing together, cases of quiet injustice, of rights trampled under the weight of authority, a black man in a world that often judged him before knowing him. David had spent years carving out a legacy as a federal human rights investigator, a protector of the vulnerable, a relentless seeker of truth. That day, though, as he stepped off the curb to cross the street, the sharp wail of a siren sliced through the air, and flashing blue lights pinned him in place like a spotlight on a stage he hadn't chosen. Sergeant Doyle emerged from the patrol car, his broad frame casting an imposing shadow, a man hardened by years of wielding power. Doyle carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the badge on his chest made him untouchable. His voice, rough as gravel, barked out a command, "Stop right there." David paused, turning slowly, his dark eyes meeting Doyle's with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside him. He knew the law of every statute, every loophole better than most lawyers, and he knew the stop was flimsy at best. "I didn't break any laws," David said, his tone even, measured. "Why are you stopping me?" Doyle's lip curled, his patience already fraying. "You crossed the street illegally. That's a violation. I need to see your ID." The demand hung heavy in the air, laced with an authority that didn't invite questions. David took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This wasn't about jaywalking, or could sense it in the officer's stance, in the way Doyle's hand hovered near his radio. This was about control, about a man in uniform flexing his power over someone he assumed wouldn't push back. "You're not detaining me for jaywalking," David replied, his voice steady as steel. Doyle's face twisted, a flash of frustration breaking through his gruff exterior. "I said show me your ID," he snapped, stepping closer, his bulk looming. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a routine encounter, a cop hassling someone over a minor infraction, the kind of thing that ends with a ticket or a warning. But to David, it felt like the opening move in a game he'd seen played too many times before. He'd spent his career unraveling abuses of power, standing up for those who couldn't stand for themselves, and now here he was, caught in the same web he'd dedicated his life to dismantling. The air grew thick with tension, each word a spark threatening to ignite something bigger. Doyle, sensing resistance, reached for his radio, his voice low and clipped as he called for backup. Within moments, 2 more officers arrived, their boots thudding against the pavement, their presence turning a simple stop into a show of force. David stood his ground, his heart pounding, but his expression unshaken. "Cuff him," Doyle ordered, his tone leaving no room for dissent. The younger officers hesitated for a split second. Officer Carter, a weary man with nervous eyes, and Officer Ramirez, a stocky figure who seemed more resigned than eager before stepping forward. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into David's wrists as they snapped shut, and a wave of disbelief washed over him. He wasn't just any civilian, he was David Louise, a man who'd faced down corrupt officials and dangerous criminals, a man who'd built his life on the pursuit of justice. Yet in this moment, he was reduced to a target, a pawn in someone else's display of dominance. The ride to the station was a blur of silence and simmering rage. David sat in the back of the patrol car, the hum of the engine underscoring the chaos in his mind. He replayed the encounter over and over, each detail sharpening his resolve. This wasn't just about him, it was about the countless others who'd faced the same treatment, who didn't have his knowledge or his position to fight back. By the time they reached the precinct, a squat, gray building that smelled of stale coffee and regret, David's anger had crystallized into something fiercer: purpose. They led him through the station, past flickering fluorescent lights and cluttered desks, to an old, rusted cage in the center of the room, a holding cell that looked more like a relic from another era than a tool of modern law enforcement. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the small, stark space. David leaned against the cold metal bench, his wrists still aching from the cuffs, and let his gaze sweep the room. The walls were scuffed and peeling, the air heavy with the weight of forgotten stories. He'd been in places like this before, but always on the other side interviewing victims, gathering evidence, building cases. Now, locked inside, the absurdity of it all struck him like a punch to the gut. Jaywalking, a trivial excuse for something far uglier, a system that thrived on unchecked power, that preyed on those it was meant to protect. But David wasn't just any prisoner. He was a man who'd spent decades exposing corruption. And this injustice, this petty act of tyranny, was about to become his weapon. Back at the precinct, Sergeant Doyle paced the narrow hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing off the linoleum. He'd thought David was just another name on a report, another face to intimidate into submission. But now doubt gnawed at him, a flicker of fear he couldn't quite suppress. Officer Carter approached, his voice trembling slightly as he clutched a clipboard. "Sir, we've got a problem. This guy is not just some nobody. He's a federal investigator." Doyle's jaw tightened, his thick fingers rubbing at his temples. "I know who he is," he growled. "He's a troublemaker. Always has been." He paused, his mind racing. "But we can't let him out now, not after this. What if he takes it higher?" Carter shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to the floor. He'd seen the videos starting to circulate on Linnegrani's cell phone footage of the arrest, angry comments piling up on social media. The media was sniffing around, and this wasn't the kind of story that faded quietly. "He might already be planning to," Carter muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Doyle's expression darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Let him try," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "We'll handle this our way, carefully." Meanwhile, inside the cage, David's thoughts churned like a storm gathering strength. He wasn't just a victim of one officer's ego, was a witness to a deeper rot, a culture of authority that flexed its muscle without consequence. He'd seen it before in distant cities, in case files and courtroom testimonies. But now it was personal, visceral. The soreness in his wrists, the clang of the cell door, it all fueled a fire that had been smoldering for years. He wouldn't let this be buried. If he could turn this moment into a reckoning, if he could shine a light on the corruption festering within law enforcement, he would. This wasn't just about his freedom anymore, it was about the people he'd sworn to protect. The ones who suffered in silence, the ones who never got a chance to fight back. Time stretched on, the minutes ticking by in the dim light of the holding cell. David's mind worked tirelessly, mapping out his next moves, imagining the ripple effects of what was to come. Then the door creaked open, and an officer he hadn't seen before stepped inside, dragging a chair across the floor. The man was older, his face lined with the weariness of too many years on the job. He sat across from David, a clipboard balanced on his knee, and flipped through a stack of papers. "David Louise," he said, his voice flat as he scanned the file, "you've been making quite a stir. What's your angle?" David leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the officer's with an intensity that could cut through steel. "My angle," he said, his voice low and deliberate. The truth about how this system operatio, it targets people, abuses power, and thinks it can get away with it." The officer scribbled something down, his expression unreadable, but David could see the faintest twitch in his jaw. This wasn't a man used to being challenged. "Not like this. You're a federal investigator, correct?" the officer asked, his tone still neutral. "That's right," David replied, unflinching. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're making this harder on yourself." David almost smiled a small, defiant curve of his lips. He'd heard that line before, from men who thought they could intimidate him into silence. But he wasn't here to back down. He was here to expose the cracks in a system that thrived on fear and control, to show that justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, one that could topple even the most entrenched abuses of power. What had started as a single, unjust act was spiraling into something unstoppable, a battle that would echo far beyond this. Rusty cage, a fight for the soul of a system that had lost its way. And David Louise, with every ounce of his being, was ready to lead it. In the dimly lit interrogation room, the air hung heavy with unspoken words and simmering tension. David Louise sat rigid in his chair, his piercing gaze locked on the officer across from him. The faint hum of a flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows across the cracked concrete walls. The officer, a man with tired eyes and a creased uniform, leaned forward, his voice soft but edged with a plea. "Look, we could just let this slide," he said, his pen hovering over a half-written report. "You could walk out that door, go home to your life, and we wouldn't have to turn this into something messy. No one would have to know." David's lips tightened into a thin line, his chest rising with a slow, deliberate breath. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, resolute murmur that carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much to stay silent. "That's the whole problem, isn't it? You think this can just vanish. You want to bury it. Pretend it's nothing. Sweep it under some dusty rug where no one will look. But this," he paused, his eyes narrowing with fierce determination. "This isn't disappearing. Not this time." His words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the stifling air. The officer's pen froze mid-sentence, his hand trembling ever so slightly. For a fleeting moment, David caught a flicker of uncertainty in the man's gaze, a crack in his composed facade. It was the look of someone who'd expected compliance, not defiance. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in as if they, too, were complicit in the struggle unfolding. David's entire being radiated a quiet, unyielding intensity, every muscle taut with purpose. He wasn't just David Louise, federal investigator, anymore. He was a man who'd crossed a threshold, a man who'd decided that the truth was worth any price. The officer shifted in his seat, his initial confidence eroding like sand under a relentless tide. He'd walked into this room expecting David to buckle, to crumble under the weight of authority. After all, to him, David was just another name on a report, another suspect to process and discard. But David was no ordinary man. He carried a fire within him, a purpose that burned brighter with every attempt to snuff it out. "I'm telling you," the officer said, his voice wavering as he tried to regain control. "You're blowing this out of proportion. Just say you were wrong, and we can all move on. No harm done." His words sounded hollow, even to himself, as if he were reciting a script he no longer believed. David straightened in his chair, his posture unyielding, his presence an unshakable force. "This isn't about me being wrong," he replied, his tone steady and piercing. "It's about what this stands for. You've seen it before, haven't you? People pushed around, crushed under the system's boot because no one dares to push back. But you've crossed a line this time. I'm not some nobody you can trample and forget." Silence fell, thick and heavy, as the officer's jaw tightened. He stared at David, searching for a way to regain the upper hand, his mind racing to calculate his next move. David could see an internal war playing out behind the man's eyes. Was it worth escalating this, or was it easier to let it fade, to join the countless other incidents buried in the shadows of bureaucracy? For a moment, the officer said nothing, his gaze darting toward the door as if seeking an escape. Then, with a subtle nod, he signaled to someone beyond the glass. The door creaked open, and a second officer stepped in, his presence shifting the room's energy like a storm rolling over a calm sea. This man was differentaler, broader, with a hardened edge to his demeanor that spoke of years spent navigating conflict. His sharp eyes flicked between David and the first officer, assessing the scene with a predator's precision. "What's going on here, Daniels?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The first officer, Daniels, hesitated, then let out a weary sigh as he slid the folder across the table. "He's a federal investigator," Daniels muttered, his tone laced with frustration. "Says he's ready to make this a bigger deal than it needs to be." The second officer, his name tag Red Harris, turned his gaze on David, studying him with a mix of curiosity and steel. There was a flicker in his eyes, a spark of something that might have been recognition, or even a grudging respect, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. He leaned forward, his hands braced on the table, his voice dropping to a chilling monotone. "You're not going anywhere," he said flatly. "You're staying right here until we figure out what to do with you." The words were a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down, but David didn't flinch. Inside, a quiet storm churned, fueled by the realization that they saw him as a criminal when, in truth, he held the power to unravel their carefully guarded world. Miles away, back at the precinct, Sergeant Doyle paced the linoleum floor of his cluttered office, his boots scuffing against the worn tiles. The faint buzz of a radio crackled in the background, spitting out updates he didn't want to hear. His broad shoulders were hunched, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. He'd hoped this would be simple. David would back down, slink away into the system's machinery, and the whole mess would dissolve into nothing. But David wasn't bending. He was growing, becoming something larger than Doyle had anticipated, a symbol of everything rotten in the world they'd built. The media had already sniffed out the arrest, their vulture-like instincts honing in on the scent of scandal. It wouldn't be long before the questions started, before the pressure bore down like a vice. "I told you this was going to explode," Officer Carter muttered from the doorway, rubbing his temples as if he could massage away the headache this had become. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot from too many sleepless hours. "The media's swarming us now. The city's waking up, asking what the hell's going on." Doyle stopped pacing, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his desk. "I don't give a damn about the media," he growled, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. "I care about keeping this contained. We can't let David turn this into some righteous crusade." Carter swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He wasn't sure how much longer they could hold the lid in it. When David's story was spreading like wildfire, igniting whispers of dissent among the public. Meanwhile, in the suffocating confines of the interrogation room, David sat motionless, his mind a whirlwind of strategy and resolve. The walls might have held his body, but they couldn't cage his thoughts. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a burden that threatened to crush lesser men. But for David, it was fuel. This wasn't just about his freedom anymore. It was about peeling back the layers of a system that thrived on silence, about exposing the festering wounds of corruption and abuse. He'd faced crooked officials before, stared down threats that would have broken most, and emerged stronger every time. But this fight was different. It wasn't just about justice, it was about the soul of the system itself, about proving that power unchecked would always lead to ruin. Back at the precinct, the air had shifted, thick with unease. The officers who'd once strutted with confidence now moved with hurried steps, their voices hushed as if afraid of being overheard. They'd underestimated David, assumed he'd be a footnote in their ledger of control. But what they'd dismissed as a routine arrest had spiraled into a legal quagmire, a political inferno that threatened to consume them all. David wasn't just a detainee anymore. He was a beacon, a man with the will and the means to topple the fragile empire they'd built. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and momentum. What began as a quiet detainment erupted into a city-wide flashpoint, drawing eyes from every corner. The moment grainy footage of David's arrest leaked online, the narrative flipped. He wasn't just a man caught in a petty infraction. He was a living emblem of systemic failure, a voice for the voiceless. The media pounced, amplifying the cries of activists, human rights advocates, and everyday people who'd long simmered in frustration at law enforcement's unchecked reign. Television anchors dissected the story, newspapers churned out fiery editorials, and social media buzzed with hashtags and outrage. In his holding cell, far from the clamor, David sat with his back against the cold wall, his sharp mind attuned to the distant rumble of change. He'd seen it before, how a single spark could ignite a movement, how public fury could shift the tides. And now, he was that spark. His fight had transcended his own fate, blossoming into a broader reckoning about accountability, about the cost of power wielded without restraint. Outside, protests sprouted like wildflowers after a rain, small at first clusters of determined voices chanting outside the precinct, but swelling with each passing day. Soon, the streets thrummed with hundreds, then thousands, their cries unified, justice for David Luiz. Inside the precinct, Sergeant Doyle felt the ground slipping beneath him. Once a man of unshakable authority, he now navigated a storm he couldn't tame. "We've got a real problem," Carter said one morning, his voice heavy with exhaustion as he slumped into a chair. "This isn't staying quiet. The mayor's office is fielding calls. The news won't let up hell. Even my wife's asking me about it." Doyle's grip tightened around his coffee mug, the ceramic creaking under his fingers. "I know," he muttered, his eyes shadowed with dread. "I thought we could bury this, but it's bigger than us now." The protests outside roared louder, a tidal wave of anger crashing against the precinct's walls, a testament to the consequences of their arrogance. In his cell, David remained a pillar of focus, his thoughts cutting through the chaos like a blade. The public's rage wasn't just about him, it was the culmination of years of silenced voices, of lives dismissed by a system that prized control over fairness. He knew what this could become, not just a case, but a clarion call to dismantle the machinery of abuse. Later that day, his call to his lawyer was brief but electric. "We're not letting this fade," he said, his voice a steady flame. "Put it all on the record. This isn't just about me, it's about showing the world what happens when power forgets its limits. This needs to be a movement." His lawyer, a grizzled veteran of countless battles, paused on the other end, then replied with a quiet, "Understood." The line went dead, but the fight was just beginning. David's story was a lesson carved in fire and stone. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed by the powerful, it was a right wrested from their hands. And when power overreached, when it crushed the innocent under its heel, the consequences would echo far beyond a single room, a single arrest, a single man. They'd tried to silence him, but in doing so, they'd awakened a force they couldn't contain. In the dimly lit corners of a bustling city, where the hum of unrest vibrated through the streets, David stood resolute, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and unshakable determination. His voice, steady despite the storm brewing within, cut through the tension as he spoke to his allies. "We'll drag this into the courts. We'll build a case so undeniable, so loud, that they'll have no choice but to face it. But brace yourself, this isn't going to be quick or easy." The words hung heavy in the air, a promise of a grueling battle ahead. David's eyes gleamed with a fierce readiness, his mind already racing through the sacrifices he'd have to make. He wasn't just stepping into a courtroom. He was stepping into a warren where justice was the prize, and the stakes were nothing less than the soul of a community. Outside, the city pulsed with a growing roar, the people's voices, once mere whispers drowned by the machinery of power, had swelled into a chorus that could no longer be ignored. Every flickering television screen in cramped apartments, corner stores, and bustling bars broadcasted the same vivid scenes, crowds marching with handmade signs, impassioned speeches echoing off concrete walls, and interviews with fiery advocates who refused to let the truth stay buried. What had started as David's personal nightmare, wrongful arrest, meant to silence him, had ignited something far greater. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was a spark that had caught the dry tinder of a city fed up with being overlooked, a movement that breathed empowerment into the air like oxygen after years of suffocation. People who had once bowed their heads in resignation now stood tall, their demands for accountability ringing out like a thunderclap. Beyond the precinct's cold, gray walls, the police squirmed under the weight of their miscalculation. They had seen David as an easy target, a man they could cuff, process, and forget. But his quiet strength, his refusal to crumble, had turned their simple plan into a raging firestorm. Sergeant Doyle, a grizzled veteran with a jaw perpetually clenched from years of wielding authority, sat hunched over his cluttered desk. His fingers trembled slightly as he shuffled through a mountain of reports, each one a testament to how badly he'd underestimated his opponent. The protests outside weren't just noise anymore, they were a symphony of outrage, growing sharper and more deliberate with every passing day. Organizers had taken the reins, channeling the chaos into a focused call for reform. They demanded investigations into the department's shadowy corners, insisting that the officers involved be stripped of their shields and held to the light. Doyle's chest tightened with dread. What he'd hoped would fade into a footnote was now a headline that threatened to unravel his career and the system he'd sworn to protect. The media, once content to skim the surface of the story, had sunk its teeth in deep. Reporters who had initially shrugged off David's arrest as routine now dug into the rot. Beneath it, polished misconduct, systemic inequality, the quiet abuses that had festered for decades. Every new revelation sent tremors through the city, fueling the protests and sharpening the public's gaze on law enforcement. Doyle's voice cracked as he looked up at Officer Carter, a younger man whose usual confidence had been replaced by a flicker of unease. "How long until we can bury this?" Doyle rasped, his throat dry with desperation. Carter shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor, It's not that simple anymore, sir. The public's all in, mayor's even talking reform. This thing's got legs now, and we can't just wish it away. Doyle's fist crashed onto the desk, the sound sharp and hollow in the tense room. Then we stop it before it swallows us whole, he growled, his mind racing for a way to claw back control. David wants a fight. Fine. We'll give him one he won't walk away from. Meanwhile, David sat alone in his cell, the cold concrete walls pressing in around him. But isolation couldn't dim the fire in his chest. He could feel the world shifting beyond those barshed chants of the protesters, the crackle of news reports, the swell of a movement that had taken his story and made it their own. His arrest, once dismissed as a minor blip, had become a rallying cry for a city tired of being trampled. What had begun as a personal quest for justice had morphed into something monumental, a chance to expose a system so fractured it creaked under its own weight. The pressure was immense, a constant hum in his ears, but it only steeled his resolve. As he traced the cracks in the wall with his fingertips, he thought of the thousands who'd suffered in silence before him. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs, too. He wasn't a prisoner, he was a beacon, shining light into the dark corners where power had festered unchecked for too long. The city itself seemed to hold its breath as the legal battle took shape. David's lawyer, Michael Turner, was a force of nature, a seasoned litigator with a sharp mind and a reputation for taking on giants. In their first meeting, held in a cramped, fluorescent-lit room, Turner leaned across the table, his gaze piercing. "This is bigger than just you, David," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. "We're not just fighting for your freedom, we're fighting to make damn sure no one else has to endure what you did. This is about tearing down the walls that let this happen." David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Turner wasn't just a hired hand, he was a partner in this crusade, as invested in the cause as David himself. Together, they mapped out a strategy that went beyond the specifics of the arrest. They aimed to build a case so airtight, so explosive, that it would ripple through the entire law enforcement community. A warning that the days of impunity were numbered. Outside, the streets teemed with life and fury. Protesters flooded the pavement, their voices rising in a unified chant that drowned out the city's usual din. They weren't just there for David, they were there for every untold story, every injustice swept under the rug. The movement had grown roots, drawing in organizers, activists, and ordinary people who'd finally found their courage. Television screens glowed, with heated debate talk show hosts dissecting police brutality, activists demanding action, news anchors tracking every twist and turn with a fervor that bordered on obsession. What had once been a quiet arrest in a forgotten alley had ballooned into a nationwide reckoning. David, though confined, could sense the energy coursing through the air. Each protest, each story, made him feel less alone, like his voice had multiplied 1,000-fold, echoing across a nation ready to listen. Back at the precinct, the air was thick with panic. Doyle met with his superiors in a sterile conference room, the blinds drawn tight against the chaos outside. His once unshakable confidence had eroded, replaced by a gnawing fear that his world was slipping away. "We've got to end this," he insisted, his voice taut with frustration. "It's not just about David anymore, it's the whole damn department. If we don't get a grip on this, we're finished." His superiors exchanged uneasy glances, their faces etched with the same realization. This wasn't a storm they could ride out. The mayor's office had already caved to public pressure, promising reviews and reforms, while reporters hounded city officials with questions that cut too close to the bone. Doyle muttered under his breath, "The media's got us by the throat. If we don't turn this around, we're the next headline." But it wasn't just the press they had to fear, it was the people, united in a way that shook the foundations of their authority. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial loomed closer. Protesters lined the streets outside, their signs swaying in the wind, their chants a constant drumbeat of defiance. Inside, David sat at the back, his hands clasped tightly as he watched the proceedings unfold. His mind wasn't just on the legal arguments, it was on the bigger picture, the chance to dismantle a machine that had crushed so many before him. Turner worked tirelessly, piecing together evidence with the precision of a surgeon. But David knew this was more than a courtroom victory. It was a lesson in justice, a stark reminder that power, when abused, would face consequences. The protests had become a living force, a tide that refused to recede, and with every step forward, David felt the weight of a nation on his shoulders. This was no longer about one man's freedom, it was about a system laid bare, a truth that could no longer be denied. As the gavel fell and the fight pressed on, David steeled himself for the long road ahead. Knowing the world was finally waking up, David stood alone in the dim light of his cluttered office, the faint hum of the city filtering through the cracked window. Papers were strewn across his desk, each one a fragment of a larger puzzle he'd been piecing together for years. He'd spent half a decade digging into the dark corners of law enforcement, peeling back layers of corruption that clung like damp rot to the institutions meant to protect. The abuses he'd uncovered: excessive force, falsified reports. Officers shielded by a code of silence had fueled his resolve. But this time, it wasn't just another case. This was personal. The corruption wasn't out there in some distant precinct. It was festering in his own neighborhood, in the very system he'd once trusted. His hands trembled slightly as he sifted through the files, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He wasn't just chasing justice anymore, he was demanding it. For himself and for every soul crushed under the same heavy boot. Years of experience had taught David that real change didn't come from pointing fingers at shadows. It required evidence, cold and irrefutable, laid bare for the world to see. He'd built a small but fiercely loyal team of investigators who shared his fire. Men and women who'd seen the same injustices and refused to look away. Together, they worked in the quiet hours, poring over departmental records that smelled of dust and deceit. They interviewed officers who'd long since left the force, their voices low and hesitant, as if the walls still listened. They tracked down former employees who'd been pushed out for asking too many questions, their stories spilling out in hurried whispers over cups of stale coffee. Every arrest report, every complaint of brutality, every suspiciously vague internal review, they stitched it all together, thread by thread, into a tapestry of systemic rot. David's heart raced as he read the patterns aloud to his team, his voice steady but his mind reeling. If they could prove this wasn't just a few bad apples, but a poisoned orchard, the public would have no choice but to listen. His own arrest, unjust, humiliating, a petty power play, would become the spark that lit the fuse. But it wasn't just the precinct that gnawed at David's thoughts. It was the culture that cradled it, a sprawling web of complicity that stretched far beyond the station's chipped paint and flickering lights. He paced his office late into the night, the floorboards creaking under his restless steps, imagining the faces of those who'd suffered before him. Mothers who'd lost sons to fabricated charges, kids beaten for daring to look an officer in the eye, families left voiceless because the system didn't care to hear them. This wasn't just his fight, it was theirs too. If he could drag this ugliness into the light, if he could force the department to face its own reflection, it might crack the foundation of something much bigger. Justice, he thought, wasn't a gift handed down. It was a fire you had to stoke with your own hands. And he'd burn the whole damn house down if that's what it took. Michael Turner had been David's anchor in those early, chaotic days. A weary man with sharp eyes and a voice that could cut through steel. Michael had spent years navigating the legal maze David now found himself trapped in. Over endless nights at a scarred wooden table, Michael had guided him, his calm demeanor a lifeline amid the storm. "This isn't just about you, David," he'd said once, his words lingering like smoke. "It's about what happens when power forgets its place." Michael's belief in the case was unshakable. But David knew the courtroom was only one battlefield. The real war was in the evidence-ith smoking gun that would turn whispers into roars. The media had already begun to circle, their headlines hungry for a hero. But David didn't trust their fickle loyalty. He needed proof so solid it couldn't be ignored. A foundation that would make the ground shake beneath the department's feet. The breakthrough came on a frigid evening, the kind where the wind howled like a warning through the empty streets. David sat hunched over a stack of yellowed complaint forms, his breath fogging in the unheated room, when his lead investigator, Sarah, burst in. Her coat was dusted with snow, her face alight with something fierce. "We've got it," she said, dropping a thick folder onto the desk with a thud that echoed in the silence. David's pulse quickened as he flipped through the pages, each one a dagger aimed at the precinct's heart. There was a chilling rhythm in the records, a pattern of complaints against multiple officers, including Sergeant Doyle, that had been filed, glanced at, and then buried. No follow-ups, no discipline, just a quiet erasure of every cry for help. David's stomach churned as he read the names, the dates, the stories of lives upended and dismissed. This wasn't negligence, it was a machine designed to protect its own, oiled with silence and fear. Sarah lingered by the desk, her breath still ragged from the cold, her eyes burning with the same fury David felt. She'd been with him since the beginning, a former clerk who'd quit the department after watching one too many reports vanish into the void. They thought no one would notice, she said, her voice low but trembling with indignation. They thought they could keep doing this forever. David nodded, his jaw tight. He could picture Sergeant Doyle broad-shouldered, smug, a man who'd worn his badge like a crown for over 2 decades. Doyle had been named in complaint after complaint, each one brushed aside with a smirk and a shrug. But this time, David thought, that smirk wouldn't save him. The team doubled down, working through sleepless nights, their fingers stained with ink as they cross-referenced every document, every testimony, every scrap of truth they could claw from the shadows. What emerged wasn't just a case against Doyle, it was a portrait of a department, rotten from the roots up, its sergeants and captains complicit in a cover-up that stretched years into the past. The deeper they dug, the higher the stakes climbed. The precinct wasn't just a building, it was a fortress, backed by a city government that flinched at the thought of reform. The mayor's office issued vague statements, their words dripping with caution, while the district attorney's desk piled high with pressure from above. David felt the weight of it all pressing against his chest, a suffocating reminder that he wasn't just fighting officers, was fighting a legacy of power that had grown fat on impunity. Every new piece of evidence tightened the noose, not just around Doyle, but around everyone who'd looked the other way. The public was waking up. Protests flared outside the station, voices rising in a chorus of anger, but David knew outrage alone wouldn't win this. He needed the law to bend, to break if necessary, and he wouldn't stop until it did. For Sergeant Doyle, the air was growing thin. He sat in his dimly lit office, the blinds drawn tight against the world outside, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk. The protests echoed faintly through the walls, a constant hum that gnawed at his nerves. He'd been untouchable once, a king in a kingdom of blue uniforms, his word law and his actions unquestioned. 20 years on the force had hardened him, taught him how to bury mistakes and silence dissent. He'd seen the good lives saved, streets cleaned, but he'd also seen the ugly, and he'd made his peace with it, or so he'd thought. Now David's investigation loomed like a shadow he couldn't shake, its tendrils creeping closer with every passing day. The complaints he'd dismissed as noise, the reports he'd signed off on without a second glance at, they were piling up, a mountain of his own making. His chest tightened as he replayed the moments in his mind, the arrests he'd justified, the corners he'd cut. The world was changing, and he was running out of places to hide. The morning of the court hearing dawned gray and heavy, the sky pressing low over the city like a lid on a boiling pot. David stepped into the courthouse, his shoes clicking against the polished floor, the sound swallowed by the buzz of the crowd. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing like lightning, while activists lined the benches, their faces a mix of hope and defiance. The air crackled with tension, thick with the weight of what this day could mean. David's throat tightened as he took his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He'd fought for justice before, but never like this, never with the eyes of a city, maybe a nation, watching his every move. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a symbol, a voice for the voiceless, and the responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. Michael Turner stood beside him, his suit crisp, his posture unyielding. He'd spent weeks crafting their argument, weaving David's story into a broader narrative of abuse and accountability. "We're not just here to free you," he'd told David the night before, his voice steady over the phone. "We're here to show them what happens when power runs wild." In the courtroom, Michael's words rang out, sharp and precise, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. He laid out the evidence: Sedavid's arrest, a flimsy excuse for jaywalking that masked a deeper intent to silence him, The pattern of brutality that stretched back years. The department's refusal to hold its own accountable. Each point landed like a hammer, and David watched the faces in the room shift, some nodding, some squirming, all feeling the tide turn. Sergeant Doyle took the stand last, his broad frame filling the space. But his eyes betrayed him, darting, uncertain, a man staring down the barrel of his own reckoning. He tried to lean on his old swagger, his voice gruff as he recounted the arrest. But it faltered under Michael's relentless questioning. "You knew who David was?" Michael pressed, his tone icy. "You knew he was digging into your precinct, and you wanted him quiet." Doyle shifted, sweat gleaming on his brow, his denials thin and brittle. The courtroom held its breath as the past unraveled, accomplices ignored, lives ruined. A career built on sand. David watched, his heart pounding. Not with triumph, but with a grim clarity. This wasn't just about Doyle's folly, it was about the lesson carved into every moment of this fight. Power without justice was a hollow shell, and its collapse was inevitable. The wheels of justice turned slow, but David felt them grinding forward, propelled by every voice that had joined his, every hand that had helped lift this burden. The hearing stretched into hours, the air thick with anticipation, but he never wavered. This was bigger than him, bigger than Doyle, bigger than any one precinct. It was about a system forced to face its sins, about consequences that couldn't be buried anymore. And as the gavel fell, whatever the outcome, David knew one thing: he'd lit a fire that wouldn't die, a blaze to remind the powerful that their time, too, could run out. In the dimly lit courtroom, the air hung heavy with tension, thick enough to choke on. Sergeant Doyle sat at the defense table, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his hands together, as if trying to hold onto the last threads of a life unraveling before him. Once, he had been a towering figure, broad-shouldered, voice booming, his badge a shield of unquestioned authority. Now, his face was a mask of pallor, drained of its usual arrogance, his eyes darting anywhere but toward Michael Turner, who stood like a sentinel of truth across the room. The cracks in Doyle's carefully built persona weren't just visible, they were gaping wounds, bleeding out years of deceit for all to witness. He hadn't expected this. Not the exposure, not the escalation, not the way every whispered misdeed was now shouted from the rooftops. He'd thought his power was untouchable, his empire unshakable. How wrong he'd been. David Louise sat a few rows back, his posture steady, but his chest tight with a storm of emotions he couldn't quite name. Relief mingled with exhaustion, anger simmered beneath hope, and a quiet resolve pulsed through every breath he took. This wasn't just about him anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. His wrongful arrest had been the spark, but what burned now was a fire fed by the silenced cries of countless others, people whose stories had been buried under the weight of a corrupt system. David's dark eyes locked on the stand, unwavering, as the trial unfolded like a slow, relentless tide eroding the shore of Doyle's defenses. He could feel the shift in the room, the way the energy tilted towards something bigger than one man's. He wasn't just watching Doyle fall, was watching a reckoning unfold, a lesson in justice that cut deeper than personal vindication. Outside, the streets buzzed with restless energy. The community had gathered in droves, their voices rising in a chorus of frustration and fury that echoed off the courthouse walls. Signs bobbed in the air, justice for David, and the silence. No more lease. Each word a brick in the wall of momentum building against the old guard. The protests had started small, a handful of outraged neighbors, but now they swelled into a movement, a living, breathing demand for change that refused to be ignored. Inside, the courtroom thrummed with its own electricity, every rustle of paper, every cleared throat amplifying the stakes. The evidence piled up like stones in a cairn, marking Doyle's guilt testimonies from trembling rookies he'd bullied into silence, stacks of falsified reports, and that final, devastating blow, an audio recording. Doyle's own voice dripping with casual cruelty as he instructed a fellow officer to bury a complaint of brutality. The room froze when it played, the hiss of static giving way to his damning words. Even the judge, a stern woman with steel-gray hair and a face carved from years of impartiality, seemed to stiffen, her lips pressing into a thin line. Doyle's unraveling was a quiet, pitiful thing. Gone was the man who'd strode through the precinct like a king, his chest puffed with the certainty that no one would dare cross him. Now, he slumped in his chair, shoulders hunched, as if the weight of his own lies had finally crushed him. His mind raced, replaying every choice, every shortcut. Every time he'd leaned on his rank to smother a complaint or shield a crony. He'd never imagined it would come to this, a public undoing, his name dragged through the mud, his freedom dangling by a thread. The fear gnawed at him, sharp and unfamiliar, a predator he'd never had to face before. Across the room, Turner's voice sliced through the haze of his panic, steady and unrelenting. "Sergeant Doyle, you've been asked to account for your actions, days, weeks, years of them," he said, each syllable a hammer strike. "And yet, all we've heard are excuses, evasions, contradictions. You were entrusted to protect, but you've built a legacy of abuse." Doyle opened his mouth to protest, but the words faltered, crumbling like ash. His allies in the department, the ones who'd once clapped him on the back and laughed at his swagger, now sat stone-faced, their loyalty eroding under the glare of truth. David's team had dug deep, peeling back layers of rot that stretched far beyond one bad arrest. There was Officer Harris, a weary young cop with haunted eyes, who'd testified about the time Doyle had cornered him in the break room, hissing threats until Harris agreed to tweak a report. There was Maria Gonzalez, a civilian clerk whose soft voice trembled as she recounted how Doyle had dismissed her warnings about a pattern of excessive force, calling her a nosy little nobody. Each story added weight to the case, turning whispers of misconduct into a roar of corruption that couldn't be ignored. The precinct wasn't just a workplace, it was a machine, oiled by silence and fueled by fear. And Doyle had been its engineer. David felt the sting of it all over again, the memory of cuffs biting into his wrists, the smug curl of Doyle's lip as he'd barked orders that day. But now, that smugness was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell of a man who knew his castle of cards was collapsing. Turner stood tall beside David, his suit crisp, his jaw set with the determination of someone who'd seen too many injustices swept aside. He didn't just argue, he dismantled, piece by piece, every flimsy defense Doyle's lawyer threw up. The attorney, a slick man with a too-wide smile, tried to paint Doyle as a scapegoat, a victim of a vengeful system. But Turner's questions were scalpel-sharp, cutting through the bluster to expose the rot beneath. "How do you explain the altered logs?" he pressed. "The missing footage, the witnesses who say you threatened them into silence." Doyle's responses were feeble, his voice cracking as he mumbled half-truths that convinced no one. Even the gallery packed with reporters scribbling furiously, families clutching each other's hands, and a scattering of uniformed officers avoiding eye contact seemed to turn against him, the air thick with their unspoken judgment. When the jury returned, the word guilty rang out like a gunshot. The room erupted in a low rumble of murmurs, a mix of shock and triumph rippling through the crowd. Doyle didn't move, his face a blank slate, as if he'd already checked out of the moment. For David, the verdict was a bittersweet weight. He sat back, the chaos swirling around him, camera flashes popping. Turner's hand firm on his shoulder, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of the nights he'd lain awake, replaying that arrest, wondering if the system would ever bend. He thought of the others, the ones who'd never gotten this far, their names lost to filing cabinets and apathy. This one wasn't the end, it was a crack in the dam, a promise that the flood of reform might follow. Outside, the protesters cheered, their voices a raw, ragged symphony of hope and rage. The media swarmed, microphones thrust forward, headlines already taking shape: sergeant convicted in corruption case, a reckoning for the precinct. But the real lesson wasn't in the headlines or the handcuffs that would soon circle Doyle's wrists. It was in the cost of power, unchecked way it warped men like Doyle into tyrants, convinced their badges made them gods. It was in the fragility of justice, how it teetered on the edge of collapse until anyone, dared to push back. David knew the road ahead was long, that one trial wouldn't dismantle decades of decay. Yet as he looked around at Turner's steady gaze, at the families nodding through tears, at the protesters' unyielding fire, felt a flicker of something solid. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs, too, and maybe, just maybe, the consequences of Doyle's fall would echo loud enough to remind everyone: no empire built on lies, could stand forever. The air outside buzzed with energy, a chaotic symphony of voices rising from the streets as jubilant crowds cheered and chanted David's name. Reporters, perched like eager hawks, scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture the moment in headlines that would soon splash across every newspaper and screen. The protesters, a steadfast army of supporters who had shadowed David through every grueling step of his journey, now erupted in triumph, their shouts echoing off the city's concrete walls. The momentum was a living thing, pulsing through the throng, unstoppable and electric. Yet, beneath the roar of victory, David stood still, his mind heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. He understood that the system he'd challenged was a sprawling, deeply rooted beast, its tendrils sunk into every corner of power. The conviction of Sergeant Doyle, monumental as it was, felt to him like a single crack in a towering Dhamma crack that hinted at the flood to come. But only a beginning, not an end. The road stretching before him was long, shadowed, and treacherous, and he braced himself for the battles still unborn. In the weeks that followed, the world seemed to tilt toward David. The media swarmed like moths to a flame, their cameras and microphones thrusting him from the quiet obscurity of his investigative work into the blinding glare of public scrutiny. Once a solitary figure hunched over case files in dimly lit rooms, he now found his name emblazoned across front pages, his face a reluctant emblem of a burgeoning movement for police reform. The nation buzzed with debate, voices clashing over accountability and justice in law enforcement, sparked by the fire of Doyle's downfall. But David's gaze remained fixed beyond the clamor. He wasn't swayed by the fleeting glow of fame. His heart beat for a deeper purpose to weave this hard-won victory into a tapestry of lasting change. Doyle's case, though it dominated the airwaves, was merely one thread in a much larger fabric of corruption he'd begun to unravel. His investigation had peeled back layers of rot within the police department, revealing a pattern of misconduct that stretched far beyond the disgraced sergeant. The department reeled, its foundations trembling under the weight of exposed secrets, and the city's leaders squirmed as pressure mounted to respond. David wasn't alone in this storm. Michael Turner, his steadfast mentor, stood by his side, a lighthouse in the chaos. In a cramped office one evening, surrounded by stacks of papers and the faint hum of a flickering bulb, Turner leaned across the table, his eyes sharp with conviction. "We've struck a blow, David, a big one," he said, his voice steady but alive with purpose. "But this isn't the finish line. We've got to channel this into policies that stick, reforms that reshape how policing works here and everywhere else. It's not just about Doyle, it's about tearing down the scaffolding that props up this mess." David nodded, his jaw tight. He'd walked the shadowed halls of that system, seen it from every angle, first as an insider, then as its adversary. "It's rotten through and through," he replied, his voice low, simmering with a quiet fury. "It's not just the ones pulling the triggers or swinging the fists. It's the culture of silence, the winks, the nods that lets it fester. We've got to drag every last piece of it into the light, not just the ones dumb enough to get caught." The challenges loomed like storm clouds on the horizon, dark and unyielding. The district attorney's office, a fortress of self-preservation, bristled under political pressure to shield its own. Whispers slithered through the city's corridors of power rumors that the department's higher-ups had known about Doyle's brutality for years, had watched it unfold with folded arms and averted eyes. The mayor, a man of polished words and practiced smiles, had called for a review of police practices, his voice smooth as he addressed the cameras. But David saw through the performance. He knew that without a relentless push from the streets, from the courts, from every corner of a roused public, those promises would dissolve into the wind, leaving nothing but echoes. As he and Turner pored over strategies, the verdict's ripples began to settle into something tangible. The police department, once an impregnable monolith, now cracked under the strain. Officers who'd long held their tongues, complicit in their silence, started to murmur truths they'd buried. The fissures widened, and with them came a flood of voiceless ordinary people stepping forward, their own tales of abuse and betrayal spilling out like blood from old wounds. What David had begun as a probe into a single wrongful arrest had exploded into a reckoning, A Pandora's box of brutality, cover-ups, and corruption laid bare. Each new piece of evidence hit David like a hammer blow. Another shard of proof that the system wasn't just flawed, it was diseased. The victims' stories piled up, a grim chorus that drowned out any illusion of isolated incidents. This was a national wound, festering beneath the surface of countless cities. The political ground shifted beneath his feet. Lawmakers, once content to sidestep the thorny issue of reform, now faced a rising tide of demands they couldn't ignore. David's case had jolted them awake, a thunderclap that shattered their complacency. The media, too, had turned. Where they'd once eyed his efforts with skepticism, they now crowned him a reluctant hero, a beacon in the fight for justice. One night, as he sat hunched over a sprawl of case files with Turner, his phone jolted him from his thoughts. The number was unknown, a silent question mark flashing on the screen. Something the flicker of instinct urged him to answer. "David Louise," came a voice, crisp and unfamiliar. "Yes," he replied, cautious, his pulse quickening. "This is Captain Evelyn Green, Internal Affairs. We need to talk about your investigation." His breath caught. Internal Affairs was a wild card, a place he'd never expected to find an ally. "What's this about?" he asked, leaning forward, the chair creaking under his shifting weight. Green's tone was measured, but beneath it ran a current of urgency. "There's more here than you've uncovered, far more. We've been digging into the department's underbelly for months, but your work lit a fuse we couldn't. Doyle's conviction, it's an opening. We need you with us." David hesitated, his mind racing. Internal Affairs had a reputation, a machine more bent on protecting the system than purging it. Yet Green's voice carried a raw edge, a sincerity that pierced his doubts. This could be the pivot, the moment the tide turned. "I'm listening," he said finally, his words a bridge to whatever lay ahead. Over the next few days, he met Green in shadowed corners of the city dingy diners, empty parking lots where they traded secrets like contraband. She was a weary woman, her face etched with years of battles fought in silence, her eyes sharp and unyielding. She'd amassed a trove of evidence, hushed testimonies from ex-officers, paper trails of buried complaints, whispers of a network that shielded the guilty. Together, they mapped a conspiracy that snaked through the department's ranks, a web of corruption that could topple more than just Doyle. The stakes were dizzying, the chance to hold a legion of wrongdoers accountable dangling within reach. But it would take everything: David's grit, Green's insider knowledge, the legal minds he'd rallied, and the community's unyielding voice to pull it off. He felt the weight of it settle into his bones, a purpose that both exhausted and electrified him. This wasn't about one man anymore, nor one case. It was about dismantling a machine that had crushed too many for too long. The fight was far from over, but the ground beneath them trembled with possibility. What had begun as a solitary stand against a single act of cruelty had swelled into a crusade for accountability at every level. David Louise, once a quiet hunter of truth, now led the charge, his every step watched by a world holding its breath. The verdict had been a spark, but he knew justice wasn't forged in single triumphs. It was a war of attrition, a battle to uproot the rot that had flourished in the dark. The media hailed him as a champion, but he brushed off the praise. The real prize was the momentum surging around him, a wave of voices demanding reform, a tide that refused to be stemmed. The city's power brokers reeled, their carefully tended illusions crumbling. Protesters flooded the streets, lawmakers scrambled, and even the mayor, his veneer of calm cracking, faced a reckoning head-on. Policies were debated, stricter oversight, rewritten rules, but David knew words alone wouldn't heal the wound. The true test lay in the grind ahead, enforcing those promises into reality. One afternoon, as he sat in a meeting with Green, her call came again. Her voice was taut, a wire pulled to breaking. "It's bigger than we thought," she said, the words slicing through the hum of the room. "We've traced to network officers, years of dirt, and it climbs higher than Doyle. It's not just the street level, it's the chain of command." David's stomach lurched, a cold certainty settling in. He'd sensed the depth of the corruption, but hearing it laid bare was a gut punch. What he'd started as a lone mission had spiraled into an assault on a hydra, its heads multiplying with every strike. "Can we nail it down?" he asked, his mind already spinning through the chaos of possibilities. "We're close," Green replied, her resolve a steel thread. "But we've got to move fast before they bury it again. If we can blow this wide open, it could force the whole system to its knees." The lesson burned bright in David's chest. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed by the powerful, it was a prize wrested from their grip. Doyle's fall was a warning, a flare illuminating the cost of unchecked power. Every step forward revealed more shadows, but it also stoked the fire within him. With Green, Turner, and a swelling chorus of the wronged at his back, he pressed on, knowing the battle wasn't just for one city or one moment, it was for a future where no one could hide behind a badge. The cheers still rang in his ears, but they were a call to keep fighting, a reminder that the truest justice lay in the ruin of the corrupt and the rise of the just. David stood at the precipice of something monumental, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. The department he had once served was teetering on the edge of ruin, its foundations rotting beneath a veneer of authority. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, the city's desperate need for renewal, the public's growing unrest, and the faint stirrings of hope among even the most jaded officers he worked alongside. Change was no longer a distant dream, it was a necessity, raw and urgent, pulsing through the streets like a living thing. But David knew that for it to take root, every move had to be precise, every strike swift and unyielding. There was no room for hesitation now. The stakes were too high, the system too fragile. In the days that followed, David threw himself into the fray, working shoulder to shoulder with Green and her tight-knit team. Green, with her sharp eyes and unshakable resolve, was a force of nature, so men who could stare into the abyss of corruption and not flinch. Together, they peeled back layer after layer of deceit, their hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer enormity of what they uncovered. Fraudulent reports surfaced like ghosts from the archives, their falsified numbers and buried truths painting a grim picture. Hidden communication, shippered deals, and coded threats merged from the shadows, each one a thread in a sprawling tapestry of greed. And then there were the officers, men and women who had been gagged by fear or coercion, their voices now breaking free in halting, tear-streaked confessions. What had once felt like scattered sparks of wrongdoing now roared into a wildfire of systemic failure, one that had been nurtured in silence for years. The deeper they dug, the more staggering the truth became. This wasn't just about Doyle, the crooked cop David had first set his sights on. Doyle was merely a symptom, a festering sore on a body riddled with disease. The corruption stretched far beyond the precinct's grimy walls, snaking its way through other departments, coiling around the throats of city officials and law enforcement brass. It reached up into the gleaming towers of government, where power shielded itself with smiles and empty promises. David's chest tightened as the realization sank in. This was no longer a skirmish against a single rogue officer. It was a war against a Leviathan entrenched network that had grown fat on impunity, its tendrils too vast to ignore. The public rallied behind him, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage. But David's mind churned with the real battle ahead. The political arena loomed like a coliseum, where justice would face its fiercest test not in the streets, but in the hushed corridors of power. Weeks bled into one another, each day a grueling marathon of evidence and strategy. David and Green pored over documents until their eyes burned, their fingers stained with ink and coffee. They were relentless, driven by a shared conviction that the truth could no longer be buried. When the moment came to unveil their findings, they chose a press conferencia bold, calculated thrust into the heart of the city's consciousness. David stood before the cameras, the air thick with anticipation, the weight of countless eyes boring into him. His throat tightened, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a conduit for something bigger, a vessel for a reckoning that would ripple far beyond these walls. The evidence they presented was a sledgehammer rifle, devastating, laying bare a culture of corruption that had thrived in plain sight. "What you're about to hear isn't just one officer's sins," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "It's about a system that's let this poison spread unchecked. It's about a betrayal of trust hidden behind badges and oaths. Today, we drag it into the light." The room fell silent, save for the staccato clicks of shutters capturing his every word. The media leaned forward, ravenous for the story, while city officials squirmed in their seats, their polished facades cracking under the glare of scrutiny. For David, it was a turning point, a moment when the fight for justice swelled into something unstoppable. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest anymore, or even Doyle's petty tyranny. It was about tearing down the scaffolding that propped up injustice, exposing how power, when abused, devoured the very people it swore to protect. The lesson was searing. Unchecked authority didn't just bend the rulers, it shattered lives, leaving scars that spanned generations. The aftermath hit like a tidal wave. The city buzzed with chaos. The press conferences echoes reverberating through every corner. Reporters swarmed the mayor's office, their questions sharp and unrelenting, while protesters flooded the streets, their makeshift signs swaying in the wind. What had once been fleeting demonstrations now solidified into a relentless force, hundreds, then thousands, their chants shaking the pavement. David watched from his office window, the sight both exhilarating and overwhelming. The public's fury was a living thing, fueled by the evidence he'd laid bare. But he knew better than to mistake momentum for victory. Inside the mayor's chambers, the air was thick with panic. The mayor, a weary man with a politician's practiced grin, issued a statement promising a thorough investigation. His words dripped with rehearsed sincerity, but David saw through the charade. Too many had a stake in the old way, chiefs, councilors, union heads still clinging to their crumbling thrones. Green, ever the pragmatist, kept him grounded. Late one night, as they sifted through yet another stack of files, she looked up, her face etched with exhaustion. "They'll fight us tooth and nail," she said, her voice low but fierce. "But we've got the people. That's something they can't ignore." She was right. The community, once beaten down by distrust, now thrummed with fragile hope. Mothers who'd lost sons to brutality stood beside kids who'd grown up fearing sirens, their hands linked in quiet defiance. The protests weren't just noisy, they were a demand for a new dawn, for a system that didn't prey on its own. The weeks that followed were a blur of motion. David's team grew, bolstered by civil rights lawyers with fire in their veins, and advocates who'd spent decades dreaming of this moment. They met in cramped rooms, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and determination, hammering out plans for real change. Independent review boards topped their list, bodies free from departmental sway, armed with the power to probe misconduct and hold the guilty accountable. It was a simple idea, but revolutionary in its implications, a direct strike against the shield of impunity. David pictured it clearly. No more swept-under cases, no more officers skating by on connections. But the resistance was ferocious. The police union roared its dissent, claiming the reforms would cripple their ranks. "You're tying our hands," their spokesman bellowed at a tense council meeting, his face red with indignation. David, seated in the back, felt his jaw tighten. He wanted to shout back, "Your hands have been free too long, and look what they've done." But he held his tongue, letting the crowd's murmurs speak for him. One evening, after a day that left him hollowed out, David sat alone in his office, the city's skyline sprawling beyond the glass. The journey had transformed him from a lone investigator tangled in his own case to a reluctant leader of a movement that shook the earth beneath the powerful. The toll was brutal: sleepless nights, the constant hum of threats, the weight of every setback. Yet beneath the weariness burned a clarity he couldn't shake. The system had tried to crush him, framed him, silenced him, but it had only forged him into something harder, something unbreakable. Justice wasn't just a word anymore. It was a debt owed to every soul the system had failed. And the consequences of power's arrogance, they were laid bare in the streets, in the faces of the grieving, in the evidence that refused to stay buried. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, David stepped outside, the cool air brushing his face. The courthouse steps beneath his feet felt solid, a rare anchor in the tumult. Around him, the world-churned protesters' voices rising, cameras flashing, the faint promise of change hanging like mist. He wasn't alone anymore. The community stood with him, their trust a fragile gift he vowed to honor. Inside the system, too, were lice officers like Officer Tate, a weary veteran who'd slipped David a file one night, his eyes haunted but resolute. "I'm tired of looking the other way," Tate had muttered, and David felt the words like a spark. The road ahead stretched endlessly, fraught with battles yet to come, but for the first time, David let himself believe this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. As David stepped into the cool embrace of the night, a flicker of hope ignited deep within his chest, warming him against the chill that clung to the air. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling, it was a quiet, stubborn belief that something better, something fairer, could rise from the ashes of his struggles. That conviction pulsed through him, steady and strong, whispering that this was a cause worth every ounce of his strength, every weary step he took into the shadows. The streets stretched out before him, dimly lit by the soft glow of flickering streetlights, and though exhaustion weighed on his bones, he felt a surge of readiness. This wasn't the end of his path, it was merely the beginning of a long, winding road he was prepared to travel, one determined stride at a time. David Luiz's journey had been carved from the raw materials of resilience and an unyielding will to see justice served. What began as a solitary stand against the suffocating grip of a wrongful arrest had blossomed into something far greater, a movement that roared with the voices of the unheard, shaking the foundations of a system rotten with corruption. In the early days, when the cold steel of handcuffs bit into his wrists and the bitter taste of betrayal lingered on his tongue, David had felt a storm of emotions: fury at the officers who smirked as they dragged him away, despair at the thought of a life unjustly stolen, and a faint, stubborn spark of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. That spark grew into a flame as he stood in a dimly lit holding cell, staring at the cracked concrete walls, vowing to himself that he would not let this be his story's end. The world around him buzzed with life as his fight gained momentum. In the crowded streets of the city, where the hum of traffic mingled with the shouts of vendors and the distant wail of sirens, people began to whisper his name. There was Sarah, a weary woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who had once been a clerk in the courthouse. She'd seen too many innocents shuffled through the system like cattle, and David's story struck a chord in her weary heart. She joined him early, her hands trembling with quiet rage as she handed out flyers under the blistering midday sun, her voice cutting through the noise to demand accountability. Then there was Michael, a hulking man with a gentle demeanor, who owned a small auto shop on the edge of town. He'd lost a brother to the same crooked system years ago, and the pain still lingered in the lines etched across his face. He brought with him a steady strength, hauling crates of supplies to rallies and offering his shop as a meeting place. When the rain poured down in relentless sheets, through every trial, every moment of doubt, David remained a pillar of resolve. There were nights when the weight of it all pressed down on him, when the jeers of skeptics echoed in his ears, and the memory of a judge's gavel slamming against wood made his stomach twist. But there were also mornings of triumph when a crowd gathered in the town square, their voices rising in a chorus of defiance, their handmade signs swaying in the breeze like flags of a new dawn. Each victory, no matter how small, was a brick laid in the foundation of something larger. A dropped charge here, an exposed lie there. These were the threads that began to unravel the tapestry of corruption that had choked the city for too long. Yet David knew that a single courtroom win wasn't the finish line. True change was a beast that demanded patience, a relentless clawing at the walls of power until they crumbled. He saw it in the tired eyes of the mothers who approached him after rallies, their voices trembling as they spoke of sons and daughters lost to the same injustices he fought against. He felt it in the grip of an old man's handshake, the man's weathered fingers pressing into his palm as he murmured thanks for giving him hope. After decades of silence, this wasn't just about him anymore, it was about all of them, about a society that deserved to breathe free of the shadow of unchecked power. The lesson woven through David's struggle was as clear as the stars piercing the night sky. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from on high, it was a garden cultivated by those brave enough to dig into the dirt. And with justice came a warning, sharp and unyielding, about the cost of power run amok. The officers who'd laughed as they framed him, the judges who'd turned blind eyes for a bribethy, weren't just villains in his tale. They were symptoms of a sickness that thrived when good people looked away. David's fight laid bare the truth that accountability wasn't optional, it was the heartbeat of a world worth living in. Every step he took, every speech he gave under the glare of flickering lights or the soft glow of dawn, was a testament to the strength of one voice daring to demand better, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd been crushed beneath the weight of a broken system. As the city slept, blanketed in the stillness of the early hours, David walked on, his shadow stretching long and thin across the pavement. The journey ahead loomed vast and uncertain, a horizon shrouded in mist. But he carried with him the fire of those who'd joined his Causacera's fierce determination, Michael's quiet loyalty, and the countless others whose names he might never know but whose spirits marched alongside him. This was no fairy tale with a neat ending. It was a living, breathing battle, one that would stretch across months and years, fueled by the courage of those who refused to bow, and in that refusal, in the stubborn, beautiful defiance of David Luiz and the souls he'd awakened, the world glimpsed the raw, transformative power of holding the mighty to account for the sake of the wronged, for the dream of a fairer tomorrow, and for the enduring hope that one person's stand could light a spark to change it all.